Who wrote the most important religious texts ever found? For over 70 years, the identity of the Dead Sea Scrolls authors has been one of history's greatest unsolved mysteries. This video is your ultimate guide to the truth. You will journey into the desert caves where they were hidden, navigate the fierce debates among scholars, and examine the ancient clues that point to the shadowy figures behind these manuscripts. What strange community copied the Bible in a lonely desert outpost, and why did they hide their library so carefully? The answer rewrites everything we know about a pivotal moment in history. By the end, you will have the evidence to decide for yourself who really created these world-changing documents. Was it a single, devout sect waiting for the end of days, or a desperate act of preservation by priests fleeing a crumbling capital? What does it mean for a story to survive for 2,000 years, only for its tellers to vanish without a trace? The story begins not with a scholar, but with a lost goat. In the spring of 1947, a young Bedouin shepherd named Mohammed Ed-Dihib was searching the harsh cliffs northwest of the Dead Sea. His goat had wandered, and in his frustration, he picked up a stone and threw it into a small, dark opening in the rock face. Instead of the expected thud of stone on stone, he heard the distinct, sharp sound of breaking pottery. Curiosity overcame him. He climbed up, peered into the cave, and saw several large, cylindrical clay jars. Hoping for hidden treasure, he reached inside one. His fingers did not find gold coins, but bundles of old, leather-wrapped manuscripts. He had no idea that the rock he just threw had shattered the silence of 2,000 years. He pulled out a few of these strange, brittle bundles, taking them back to his clan's camp. At first, they were seen as mere curiosities, perhaps even worthless. The bundles were eventually sold to an antiquities dealer in Bethlehem for a small sum. The scrolls began a slow, convoluted journey into the hands of scholars. It was only then, as experts carefully unrolled the delicate leather and papyrus, that the world began to understand. The texts were in Hebrew and Aramaic, languages of ancient Judea. The script was archaic. Carbon dating would later confirm the impossible. These manuscripts were over 2,000 years old, dating from roughly 200 years before the Common Era to the year 70. They were the oldest copies of the Hebrew Bible ever found, predating any other known version by a full millennium. Word of the discovery spread like wildfire, igniting a frantic treasure hunt across the Judean Desert. Every cave, every crevice was searched. This first cave, now called Cave 1, was just the beginning. Who had gone to such extraordinary lengths to hide an entire library in the desert, and what were they so desperate to protect? The discovery in that single cave was merely the opening chapter. Over the next decade, 10 more caves in the same desolate region would yield their secrets, producing a staggering library of more than 900 separate manuscripts. These were not just a few scrolls, they were a vast hidden archive. Most were written on carefully prepared animal skins, parchment, with a smaller number on papyrus, and even one curious scroll made of hammered copper. Their age spans an incredible 400 years, from the 3rd century before the Common Era to the fiery climax of the 1st century. Think of it this way: if a collection of writings survived from the time of Shakespeare to the present day, all hidden in one place, you would have a similar sense of awe. This is precisely what the Dead Sea Scrolls represent, a textual time capsule sealed for 2 millennia. But what was inside this capsule? The contents are where the true revolution lies. Roughly 220 of the manuscripts are copies of books from the Hebrew Bible, what many would call the Old Testament. Every single book is represented except for the Book of Esther. These are the star witnesses, the oldest biblical texts by 1,000 years, allowing scholars to see the words with unprecedented clarity, to watch how the texts were copied and transmitted across centuries. Yet the biblical scrolls are only part of the story. Another group consists of what are known as apocryphal or pseudepigraphal works. texts that were widely read in ancient Judaism but did not become part of the official Hebrew canon. Stories of angelic visits, apocalyptic visions, and wisdom literature that existed in the vibrant spiritual marketplace of the time. The third and most mysterious category is the sectarian writings. These are texts composed by the community that owned this library, rules for how to live, interpretations of biblical prophecy, hymns of thanksgiving, and manuals for a final, cosmic war between the forces of light and darkness. It is this last group that acts as a direct fingerprint, a self-portrait of the people who wrote, copied, and ultimately hid these scrolls. They give us a raw, unfiltered look into the intense religious fervor of the Second Temple period, a time of political upheaval, diverse Jewish groups, and fervent expectation. The scrolls are not a random assortment of lost books. They are the curated library of a very specific community, one that saw itself as the true inheritors of a divine covenant, waiting in the desert for a final reckoning. So who were these librarians of the apocalypse? The search for an answer begins with the place they called home. Just a short walk from those hidden caves, perched on a barren plateau above the Dead Sea, lie the crumbling ruins of a place called Qumran. From this vantage point, you can see the shimmering, salt-heavy water below and the stark, tan cliffs of the caves themselves. It is a lonely, windswept, and brutally hot place, seemingly chosen for its isolation from the bustling world. In the early 1950s, shortly after the scrolls began to emerge, an archaeologist and Dominican priest named Father Roland de Vaux led a team to excavate these ruins. What they uncovered would become the centerpiece of the scroll mystery for generations. They found a complex with a central dining hall, ritual baths carved into the ground, a sophisticated water system channeling rare desert floods, a pottery workshop, and a strange, long room they identified as a scriptorium, a writing room, complete with low plaster tables and inkwells. To Father de Vaux and many who followed, the connection seemed obvious and thrilling. Here was the home of the scribes. This was the community that produced the library. The people of Qumran lived here, copied their sacred texts in that scriptorium, stored their finished scrolls in jars made in their own pottery kiln, and when danger approached, they hurriedly carried their most precious manuscripts the short distance to the caves for safekeeping. It was a perfect, elegant story, one that gave a physical home to the ghostly voices in the scrolls. But is it true, or is it a story we have built because we crave a simple answer? The link between the settlement and the scrolls is the most debated question in the entire saga. Was Qumran a monastery for a devout sect, a fortress, a wealthy manor house, or simply a pottery factory? The answer determines who we believe the authors were. If the scrolls were copied here, then the people of Qumran are the authors. But what if the scrolls were merely hidden here by people fleeing from somewhere else, from the chaos of Jerusalem perhaps? The ruins themselves hold clues that both support and complicate the story. For decades, one answer has dominated the conversation, a theory so elegant it became almost synonymous with the scrolls themselves. This is the Essene hypothesis. To understand it, we must step away from the desert and into the pages of history, written by men who witnessed that world firsthand. Our main guides are three ancient writers, a Jewish historian, a Jewish philosopher, and a Roman scholar. First, Flavius Josephus, a former Jewish military commander who later worked for the Romans, wrote extensively about the different Jewish groups of his time in the 1st century. He describes the Essenes as a highly disciplined, celibate brotherhood who lived a simple, communal life. They shared all property, avoided luxury, and devoted themselves to ritual purity and the study of sacred texts. Then there is Philo of Alexandria, a Jewish philosopher who praised the Essenes for their virtuous, contemplative lifestyle, emphasizing their pacifism and dedication to truth. But the most crucial testimony comes from Pliny the Elder, a Roman naturalist. In his Encyclopedia of Natural History, written around the year 77, Pliny pinpoints the Essenes on a map. He writes of a unique tribe without women who lived on the western shore of the Dead Sea above the town of Ein-Gedi. Read those words again, a community of men living west of the Dead Sea above Ein-Gedi. Now look at a map. Qumran sits precisely in that location, a lonely outpost on a plateau northwest of the Dead Sea, directly above Ein-Gedi. For Father Roland de Vaux, the archaeologist who excavated Qumran, this was the final, perfect piece of evidence. The puzzle seemed solved. The ascetic community described by the ancient historians, the isolated settlement with its ritual baths and communal dining hall, and the library of intensely religious sectarian scrolls found nearby, they were all one and the same. The people of Qumran were Essenes. The scrolls were their library, copied in their scriptorium, reflecting their unique beliefs and their fervent wait for a final divine intervention. This theory gave a name and a history to the anonymous scribes. It explained why they were in the desert, to separate themselves from a corrupt religious establishment in Jerusalem. It explained the content of the scrolls with their strict rules, their focus on purity, and their apocalyptic visions. For a long time, it felt like the mystery was closed. The Essene hypothesis was not just a theory, it was the story. But a good mystery is never that simple, and as more scrolls were studied and more archaeologists examined the ruins, cracks began to appear in this seemingly perfect picture. The most compelling evidence for the Essenes does not come from ruins or Roman historians, but from the scrolls themselves. Within the leather and ink, the community speaks in its own voice, and what it says is astonishingly specific. Among the 900 manuscripts, a handful stand out as direct rule books and manifestos. These are the sectarian writings, and they paint a portrait of a group that feels instantly familiar when you read the ancient descriptions of the Essenes. Take the Community Rule, one of the most important scrolls found in Cave 1. It is a constitution for a desert brotherhood. It lays out in meticulous detail the laws for joining this exclusive community, a probation period that lasted years. It describes their shared meals as sacred rituals, their strict hierarchy where members were ranked spiritually, and their absolute devotion to purity, truth, and the study of the law. Every aspect of life was governed, from when to speak to how to settle disputes. This was not a loose gathering of like-minded individuals. It was a regimented, all-consuming way of life, a deliberate separation from what they saw as a wicked mainstream society. Then there is the Damascus document, another foundational text. It tells a story of a founding figure, a mysterious teacher of righteousness, who led his faithful followers into a new covenant in the land of Damascus, which scholars believe is a symbolic name for the wilderness of Qumran. This teacher was opposed by a wicked priest, a corrupt figure from Jerusalem, setting up a dramatic conflict between the pure desert sect and the established temple authority. The document provides rules for communal living, including complex laws about ritual purity, Sabbath observance, and the management of camps. When you place the Community Rule and the Damascus document side by side with the accounts of Josephus and Philo, the parallels are not just interesting, they are profound. Josephus wrote of Essenes who shared property, underwent a long initiation, and were obsessed with purity. The scrolls describe exactly that. Philo wrote of their devotion to study and simple living. The scrolls mandate daily study sessions and communal ownership. The texts from the caves and the histories from Rome and Alexandria seem to be describing the same people from two different angles, one from the inside looking out and the other from the outside looking in. This internal evidence is powerful because it is first-hand. It is the community's own testimony about who they were and why they were there. They saw themselves as the true sons of light, preparing in the desert for a final war against the sons of darkness, faithfully copying their sacred texts while they waited for God's ultimate judgment. For many, this closes the case. The voices in the scrolls and the descriptions of the Essenes are a perfect match. But a perfect match in history often means someone has overlooked a crucial piece of the puzzle. The ruins of Qumran offer a physical blueprint that seems to perfectly match the written portrait. Walk through the excavated site today, and you're not touring a palace or a fortress. You are walking through the carefully designed headquarters of a purpose-driven community. The most famous room is the scriptorium. Archaeologists found a long, narrow chamber on an upper floor with low plaster benches running along the walls. At the foot of these benches, they discovered something extraordinary: 2 intact ceramic inkwells, still stained with ancient carbon-based ink. These were not storage rooms, they were writing desks. Imagine a scribe sitting here, a blank sheet of parchment stretched before him, carefully dipping his reed pen to copy the words of Isaiah or the community rule, the dry desert air swirling through the window. The very presence of a dedicated writing space, and not just one but an entire room for it, speaks volumes. This was a community that prioritized the written word above almost all else. Then, just steps away, you find the water system. In a desert where every drop is precious, the people of Qumran engineered an elaborate network of channels and cisterns to capture the flash floods that rushed down from the cliffs. Many of these reservoirs were not just for drinking, they were ritual baths known in Hebrew as mikvot. They are carved into the ground with steps leading down into them, built precisely to the specifications for Jewish ritual immersion. The sheer number of these baths is striking, far more than a typical village would need. This points to a group obsessed with spiritual purity, washing not just for cleanliness but for religious devotion, likely multiple times a day before prayers or meals. It is a physical manifestation of the scroll's constant emphasis on being ritually clean. The center of community life appears to have been a large dining hall. Adjacent to it, excavators found a pantry containing over 1,000 neatly stacked dishes, bowls, and cups, all of the same simple utilitarian design. This suggests not family meals, but large communal gatherings where members ate together as an act of unity and worship. The scrolls describe sacred communal meals, and here is the room where they likely happened. Finally, there is the cemetery. Just east of the main buildings, over 1,000 simple graves are lined in orderly rows. Each body is laid in a shallow trench, head to the south, with no grave goods, no ornaments, no indications of wealth or individual status. This austerity in death mirrors the descriptions of Essene simplicity and their belief in equality before God. The entire site, from the scriptorium to the shared dishes to the plain graves, paints a coherent picture, a self-sufficient, ascetic community of men devoted to study, ritual, and a life apart. The archaeology seems to lock the scrolls and the Essenes into the same story, set in stone and plaster. But what if we have been reading the blueprint all wrong? Yet the perfect story began to unravel. By the 1970s and 80s, a new generation of scholars looked at the same ruins and the same scrolls and saw something entirely different. They asked uncomfortable questions. If this was a secluded monastery of poor, ascetic scribes, why did archaeologists find fine glassware and imported luxury goods from distant places like Italy? Why was the settlement's tower so heavily fortified, more like a small fortress than a peaceful retreat? And perhaps most damning of all, could that famous scriptorium actually have been a dining room, with the plaster tables simply being benches for reclining at meals? The inkwells, they argued, could have been used for administrative records, not sacred texts. These were not minor quibbles, they were fundamental challenges to the entire narrative. One of the most vocal and controversial critics was a professor named Norman Golb at the University of Chicago. Golb launched a direct assault on the Essene hypothesis. He argued that the archaeology of Qumran showed nothing uniquely sectarian. The ritual baths, he pointed out, were common in Jewish settlements of the time. The dining hall and pantry could belong to a wealthy manor house or a commercial way station. The pottery found on site was of a type produced all over Judea. For Golb, Qumran was not a monastery, it was a fort, later reused as a pottery factory or a country estate. But his most explosive idea was about the scrolls themselves. He believed they had nothing to do with the people living at Qumran at all. Instead, he proposed that the caves were a geniza, a sacred storeroom for worn-out texts, or more likely, a desperate hiding place. Golb argued the scrolls represented the vast and varied libraries of Jerusalem, smuggled out of the city and hidden in the desert caves by many different Jewish groups as the Roman legions closed in during the Great Revolt around the year 70. In this view, the scrolls are not the product of a single, isolated sect, but a cross-section of Jewish literary life from the entire period, a national library buried to save it from destruction. This was a radical shift, turning the authors from a small desert brotherhood into the entire learned class of ancient Judea. The debate was no longer just academic, it became a fierce ideological battle over who owned the story of the scrolls. Golb's Jerusalem library theory forces us to reimagine the entire scene. Instead of a single sect patiently copying texts in the desert, picture the frenzied, smoke-filled chaos of a city under siege. Roman legions, led by the future Emperor Titus, are battering the walls of Jerusalem. The great temple, the heart of Jewish spiritual and intellectual life, is about to be consumed by flames. In that moment of ultimate peril, what would the priests and scholars do? They would try to save their most precious treasures, not gold but words. According to this theory, that is exactly what happened. Teams of refugees, laden with scrolls from the temple library and other great collections, fled the burning capital. Their goal was not to found a new community, but to preserve an old one. They headed for the known wilderness, the complex of caves near the Dead Sea, a place remote enough to evade Roman patrols. Qumran was not their home, it was simply a nearby landmark, a place to hastily stash a nation's literary soul before scattering or being captured. This is why Golb argued the caves contained such a breathtaking variety of texts. It was not the curated library of one group, but the salvaged fragments of many. Think of it as a time capsule buried not by a single person, but by an entire civilization in its final, desperate hours. The diversity of the scrolls themselves becomes the strongest evidence for this idea. Within the 900 manuscripts, we find starkly conflicting viewpoints living side by side. There are texts that fiercely criticize the temple priesthood in Jerusalem, yes, but there are also scrolls that uphold temple rituals and calendar systems. There are pacifistic hymns of thanksgiving, and right beside them, battle plans for a violent, apocalyptic war. Some texts are written in elegant, formal Hebrew, the language of scholars and priests, while others use a more common, everyday Aramaic. If this was the library of a single, rigid sect like the Essenes, how do we explain such internal contradictions? A group with such strict rules about belief and practice would be unlikely to carefully copy and preserve texts that directly opposed their core theology. A library of dissent would not keep the official hymnbook of the enemy, but a major national library, like the one attached to the temple, would contain exactly this kind of spectrum. It would hold the official texts, the popular religious novels, the philosophical debates, and the radical pamphlets of its day. It would be a repository of all Jewish thought, not just one strand of it. The caves, then, are not a sectarian closet, but a buried treasure chest holding the full, messy, and glorious diversity of Second Temple Judaism. This theory elegantly solves another persistent puzzle, the multiple hiding places. Why scatter the collection across 11 different caves, some incredibly difficult to access? If you are a living community using these scrolls, you keep them together in a central, protected archive. But if you are a band of refugees on the run, with Roman soldiers possibly on your trail, you do not put all your priceless eggs in one basket. You split the collection up, you hide some scrolls in this cave, some in that crevice, hoping that at least one cache will survive the chaos. The different handwriting styles, the varying qualities of parchment, and the mix of biblical, sectarian, and popular texts in each cave start to look less like an organized filing system and more like the random, hurried results of a last-ditch rescue operation. The copper scroll found in Cave 3, with its cryptic list of buried gold and silver treasure, fits awkwardly into a monastic library, but it makes perfect sense as a temple inventory, a record of sacred wealth that someone hoped to recover one day. So we are left with two compelling, yet completely incompatible stories. One tells of devout monks in the desert writing their own future. The other tells of desperate priests on the run trying to save their past. Both cannot be true. To decide between them, we must look for a single piece of evidence that could break the deadlock, something that ties the scrolls irrevocably to the ruins or just as firmly to Jerusalem. There is a third possibility, one that sidesteps the stark choice between desert monks and fleeing priests entirely. What if the authors were not fringe radicals but the religious elite themselves? This is the Sadducean connection hypothesis, a theory that places the scrolls not on the margins of Jewish society, but at its very heart, in the hands of the powerful priestly aristocracy that ran the temple in Jerusalem. The Sadducees are often remembered as the conservative, wealthy establishment, the collaborators with Roman rule who rejected ideas like the resurrection of the dead or a detailed oral law. They seem like the polar opposite of the austere, apocalyptic community we imagine at Qumran, yet several key scrolls suggest a surprising and profound link. The most important of these is a text known by its Hebrew abbreviation, MMT, which stands for Mixat Ma'is HaTorah, or some works of the law. This remarkable document is not a story or a hymn, it is a legal letter. It reads like a formal communication from one group to another, meticulously listing over 20 specific points of religious law where the writers disagree with the recipients. The debates are highly technical, focusing on the proper procedures for temple offerings, ritual purity, and tithing agricultural produce. These are not the concerns of peasant farmers or desert mystics. They are the obsessive, granular preoccupations of temple priests. The letter's tone is not one of violent rebellion, but of polemical disagreement, an attempt to persuade the other party that their interpretations of Scripture are correct. This sounds exactly like the heated legal disputes that ancient historians describe between the Sadducees and their rivals, the Pharisees. The Pharisees believed in a flexible oral tradition to interpret the written law, while the Sadducees insisted on a strict, literal reading of the scriptural text alone. MMT is a perfect example of that Sadducean mindset, a text arguing for precise, written legal positions against what its authors saw as the erroneous innovations of others. So what would the Jerusalem priestly aristocracy be doing in a remote desert outpost? Proponents of this theory suggest Qumran was not a permanent monastery, but a seasonal retreat or a study center. During certain times of the year, perhaps when their duties at the temple allowed, Sadducean priests disillusioned with the political compromises and corruption in Jerusalem could have withdrawn to Qumran. Here, away from the tumult of the city, they could engage in intense scriptural study, debate fine points of law as seen in MMT, and maintain a level of ritual purity impossible in the crowded, polluted capital. They could have used the site's many ritual baths for frequent immersion, and its scriptorium for copying not just sectarian rules, but the very biblical texts that formed the basis of their authority. In this view, the wicked priest so often vilified in the scrolls is not every high priest, but a specific corrupt individual from within their own Sadducean class who betrayed their strict principles. The community saw itself not as a new sect, but as the true, faithful remnant of the priestly line, keeping the covenant pure in the wilderness until they could rightfully reclaim control of the temple. This elegantly explains the scrolls' deep knowledge of temple ritual, their focus on priestly genealogy, and their combination of conservative legalism with fierce criticism of the current temple administration. They were not outsiders attacking the system, they were insiders who believed the system had been stolen from them. The desert was their sanctuary, a place to preserve what they saw as authentic priesthood, waiting for a moment of divine restoration. This focus on priestly lineage leads us to a name whispered through the scrolls like a sacred echo, Zadok. Many of the most important texts, including the foundational community rule, explicitly state that the ultimate spiritual authority within the group belongs to the sons of Zadok. Who was Zadok? He was the high priest who served under King David and his son Solomon, the man who anointed Solomon as king. His family line was for centuries considered the legitimate, divinely appointed high priesthood of Israel. To claim allegiance to the sons of Zadok was to claim a direct, unbroken connection to the golden age of the Davidic kingdom and the First Temple. It was to assert a supreme, unassailable religious authority. So why would a group claiming this prestigious heritage be hiding in the desert, rather than serving in the splendor of the Jerusalem temple? The answer forms another compelling theory, that Qumran was a refuge for dissident Zadokite priests. Imagine you are a priest from this ancient, revered family. You believe your line alone has the rightful duty to oversee the temple, to perform the sacrifices that maintain the covenant between God and the people. But over the centuries, political power plays, foreign invasions, and corrupt appointments have stolen that birthright. The man serving as high priest in Jerusalem is not a true Zadokite. He is a political appointee, perhaps even a collaborator with the hated Roman occupiers or the Hellenized Jewish kings who came before them. The temple rituals, in your eyes, are being performed on the wrong days according to a corrupted calendar by impure hands. What do? You cannot overthrow the powerful establishment in the city. So you withdraw, you take your family, your followers, your sacred scrolls, and you go into the wilderness just as the ancient Israelites did. You establish a community where you can maintain perfect priestly purity, observe the holy festivals on the correct, divinely mandated calendar as you understand it, and study the laws without compromise. You are not creating a new religion, you are preserving the old one in its perfect, uncorrupted form. You are waiting not just for a Messiah, but for the day when God will intervene, cleanse the temple in Jerusalem, and restore the rightful sons of Zadok to their priestly throne. This theory makes profound sense of the scrolls' obsessive details. Their intense focus on ritual baths and purity laws is not just general piety. It is the daily practice of men trained for temple service, maintaining a state of readiness to serve at a moment's notice. The furious calendar disputes that fill many texts are not minor squabbles, they are existential battles. If the temple in Jerusalem is celebrating the Day of Atonement on what you believe is the wrong date, then the entire nation's atonement is invalid. Their sins are not being forgiven. This is a cosmic catastrophe. By following a different, usually a solar-based calendar as opposed to the lunar calendar used in Jerusalem, the Qumran community was effectively declaring that they alone were in sync with God's heavenly clock. Every meal they shared, every prayer they recited, was happening in sacred time, while the rest of the world, including the temple, was spiritually adrift. Their writings about a final war and a new, purified temple are then the ultimate hope, the divine reset button. They were not just waiting for the end of the world, they were waiting for the world to be set right, for their exile in the desert to end, and for their return to a glorified Jerusalem. In this light, the ruins of Qumran transform. The many ritual baths become the necessary facilities for a community of priests. The large dining hall is the place for sacred communal meals that replaced the temple sacrifices they could no longer participate in. The scriptorium is where they copied not only scripture, but their own legal arguments and liturgical texts, building the blueprint for the true worship that would one day be restored. They saw themselves as the living, faithful core of Israel, holding the line in the desert until the dawn of a new age. This is a story of protest, of a conservative, traditionalist elite becoming radicalized by their own commitment to purity and tradition. It is the story of a priesthood in exile guarding the flame. The elegant theories of scribes and priests all depend on one foundational fact, the age of the scrolls themselves. For decades, scholars relied on educated guesses based on handwriting styles and historical context, But what if those guesses were wrong? The entire mystery needed an anchor in hard science. That anchor arrived with the quiet revolution of radiocarbon dating. This technique, developed in the mid-20th century, measures the steady decay of a radioactive isotope called carbon-14 in organic materials. Every living thing absorbs carbon-14 from the atmosphere, and when it dies, that absorption stops. The isotope decays at a predictable rate, acting like an atomic clock ticking down over millennia. By measuring how much carbon-14 remains in a piece of parchment or papyrus, scientists can calculate with remarkable precision when the animal or plant that provided the material died. In the early 1990s, a team took minute samples from a selection of Dead Sea Scrolls, carefully cutting tiny fragments from the edges of manuscripts. The results were a seismic confirmation. The tested scrolls dated from roughly the 3rd century before the Common Era to the middle of the 1st century. This scientific data perfectly aligned with the earlier estimates from paleography, the meticulous study of the shape and style of the ancient handwriting. The convergence was powerful. It proved the scrolls were genuinely ancient, not medieval forgeries or later creations. This was a triumph for authenticity, but it did little to settle the fiery debate over authorship. The science told us when the scrolls were written, but not who held the pen. It confirmed the timeline, yet the central question remained frustratingly open. A chorus of ancient voices now firmly placed in history, but still frustratingly anonymous. The true breakthrough from science came from looking closer at the very chemistry of the scrolls. Researchers began to analyze not just the age of the parchment, but the composition of the inks. Traditional carbon black ink made from soot was common, but some scrolls used a more complex iron gall ink. More fascinating were trace elements and isotopes found in the materials themselves. By studying the chemical signature of the parchment and the ink, scientists could potentially determine where the materials originated. Was the animal skin from local herds or imported from another region? Did the water used to mix the ink match the unique mineral profile of the Dead Sea area or the springs near Jerusalem? These are forensic questions, turning the scrolls into physical evidence in a 2,000-year-old case. This new avenue of research promises something extraordinary: the ability to potentially link individual scrolls to specific geographic locations. Imagine if the parchment of a sectarian rulebook chemically matched flocks known to be raised near Qumran, while the ink on a biblical scroll pointed to the water sources of Jerusalem. Such a finding could finally map the journey of these texts, showing which were truly products of the desert community and which were treasures brought from the city. We are no longer just reading the words, we are listening to the whisper of molecules, a silent testimony that might one day tell us exactly where these stories were born. But words and ink are not the only marks left behind by the authors. The handwriting itself is a unique signature, a personal imprint that survives long after the scribe has turned to dust. This is the world of paleography, the detective work of analyzing ancient scripts. When you look at a Dead Sea Scroll, you are not just reading words, you are staring directly at the hand of a person who lived 2,000 years ago. Every curve of a letter, every slant of a line, every hesitation or confident stroke is a clue. Scholars trained in this art can distinguish between different scribes by their unique hand, much like a modern handwriting expert could tell two people apart. It is a painstaking process, comparing the shape of a beth or the tail of a lamed across dozens of manuscripts, looking for consistent patterns, and what this meticulous work has uncovered is astonishing. We now know that many of the scrolls were not the product of a single, lonely scribe. Some of the longest biblical books, like the Great Isaiah Scroll, show clear evidence of multiple scribes taking turns. The handwriting changes subtly at certain points, indicating one person stopped and another picked up the pen, perhaps to share the immense labor or because a master was training an apprentice. Even more intriguing are the studies that have identified the same scribble hand appearing in different types of texts. Imagine a single, identifiable individual who copied a portion of the Book of Psalms, a sacred biblical text, and also penned sections of the sectarian-community rule, the unique lawbook of the Desert group. This is a revelation with enormous implications. What does it mean? It suggests the person writing the core scriptures of Israel was also deeply invested in the specific, radical theology of the Qumran community. They were not just a hired copyist working on a job, they were a believer intimately involved in the life and thought of the group. This connection blurs the line between biblical tradition and sectarian innovation, showing they flowed from the same source, the same dedicated individuals. So, does this evidence point to a formal scribble school operating right there at Qumran? The presence of multiple scribes, some with masterful skill and others with learners' errors, along with that physical scriptorium, certainly suggests an organized educational environment. A place where the art of sacred writing was taught, where a consistent style and theological viewpoint were passed down through generations. Yet, the paleography also reveals a surprising diversity. Not all the handwriting is the same style. Some scripts are more formal, reminiscent of the professional scribes you would find in Jerusalem. Others are rougher, more personal. This variety could mean that the community attracted scribes from different backgrounds, or that they brought scrolls with them that had been copied elsewhere. The very hands that wrote these texts whisper a complex story, one of both deep cohesion and intriguing diversity, leaving us to wonder if we are hearing a unified choir or a gathering of distinct voices that learn to sing the same haunting song. Among all these texts of law and prophecy, one scroll stands utterly apart, a metallic anomaly in a library of leather and papyrus. Found in Cave 3, it is not a book but two rolled sheets of pure copper, oxidized green and brittle with age. To read its secrets, scholars had to carefully slice it into strips, for unrolling it would have shattered the metal like glass. What they found inside was not a psalm or a community rule, but an inventory. It is a list written in a rougher form of Hebrew of 64 hiding places, and at each location, according to the scroll, a fortune is buried. The quantities are staggering, tons of gold and silver, along with precious incense and other treasures. The text gives terse, cryptic directions, mentioning landmarks like tombs, aqueducts, and specific trees. It speaks of a treasure so vast it dwarfs the wealth of entire ancient kingdoms. This is the copper scroll, and it is the single most baffling artifact in the entire Qumran collection. Its very existence shatters the serene image of a desert monastery devoted solely to spiritual contemplation. Why would a pious, ascetic community that shared all property own a secret map to unimaginable riches? And why would they etch that map onto expensive copper for permanence? The scroll feels like it fell out of a completely different story. One dominant theory is that it is exactly what it appears to be, a literal treasure map. Perhaps it records the hidden wealth of the Jerusalem temple, smuggled out and buried before the Roman siege. The listed amounts, while enormous, could align with historical accounts of temple donations over centuries. The copper medium itself is a clue, chosen because it would last far longer than parchment in damp caves, a permanent record for a future generation hoping to reclaim their sacred patrimony. In this view, the copper scroll was part of that desperate rescue operation from Jerusalem, a classified document buried with the literary scrolls for safekeeping. But other scholars hear a different message in the clang of metal. They argue the treasures are symbolic, not literal. The fantastical sums they point out are implausibly large, more like numbers from a legend or a religious vision. Could this be a list of the idealized, restored treasures of a future, perfect temple, described in material terms as an act of hope? Or is it a literary device, a metaphorical map to spiritual riches rather than physical gold? The scroll's different language and script suggest it might even be a later addition, slipped into the cave by a different group entirely, perhaps bandits or rebels who used the same hiding places. The copper scroll is a rogue piece of evidence that refuses to fit neatly into any one theory. Its presence in the caves is a loud, discordant note that forces us to reconsider everything. It screams that the story of Qumran is not simple, that the caves may have served multiple purposes for different people across time. A sect could have hidden their scriptures there for centuries, and decades later, a band of rebels or temple officials could have used the same remote location to stash a record of buried treasure. This single, strange object opens the door to a chaotic possibility that the Dead Sea Scrolls are not a single, curated library, but a layered archaeological palimpsest, a collection of deposits left by different hands for different reasons, all finding their way into the same desert safes. The Copper Scroll's strange treasure map reminds us that the world of the scrolls was far from monolithic. It was a world of fervent expectation, where many groups were reimagining faith and awaiting divine intervention. This brings us to the most explosive question of all: what did these desert texts have to do with the birth of Christianity? When scholars first translated the sectarian scrolls, they were stunned by the echoes. The parallels were not vague similarities, they were specific, powerful, and impossible to ignore. The community described a figure they called the Teacher of Righteousness, a persecuted leader chosen by God to reveal the true meaning of Scripture. They wrote of a coming Messiah, or even two Messiahs, one a royal descendant of David and one a priestly figure from the line of Aaron. They practiced ritual immersion in water, not just for cleanliness, but as a sign of spiritual conversion and entry into the community, a clear precursor to baptism. They held sacred communal meals that they believed had a profound, almost sacramental significance. They referred to themselves as the poor or the poor in spirit, a term of humility that would later resonate deeply in early Christian writings. Most strikingly, they spoke of entering into a new covenant in the land of Damascus, a direct, powerful phrase that would become central to Christian theology. Reading these texts feels, at times, like looking at a blueprint for a movement that would emerge just a few decades after the scrolls were hidden. So, what does this mean? Did John the Baptist, who preached repentance and baptized in the wilderness near the Dead Sea, spend time with this community? Did Jesus of Nazareth know their teachings? The debates this sparked were, and remain, intensely heated. One school of thought argues for direct influence. The geographic proximity is compelling. John's and Jesus' activities were in the same region. John's ascetic lifestyle, his call for a baptism of repentance, and his fierce criticism of the religious establishment in Jerusalem all mirror the ethos of the Qumran texts. Could he have been a member who broke away to start his own mission? Some scholars even point to the figure of the Teacher of Righteousness, a suffering leader rejected by the authorities, as a possible model that shaped how Jesus' earliest followers understood his mission. The connections feel too specific to be mere coincidence. Yet another, perhaps more widely accepted, view offers a different explanation. It suggests that the Qumran community and the early Jesus movement were not directly connected, but were independent branches growing from the same deeply rooted tree. They were both products of the same incredibly diverse and turbulent Jewish world of the first century. This was a time of apocalyptic hope, of numerous prophets and messianic claimants, of groups seeking purity and a new relationship with God. In this milieu, ideas like a new covenant, ritual washings, shared meals, and criticism of the temple were not the copyrighted property of one group. They were part of a common spiritual vocabulary. The scrolls, then, do not show that Christianity came from Qumran, but rather that the soil from which Christianity sprang was rich, complex, and already fertile with the very concepts that would later blossom in the Gospels. They give us the missing context, the Jewish world as it was before the temple fell, revealing that many of the ideas we think of as uniquely Christian were, in fact, vibrant Jewish ideas first. This makes the story not one of copying but of parallel revelation, showing how a revolutionary faith could emerge naturally from its time and place. The voices from the caves do not write the story of Jesus, but they write the story of the world that was waiting for him. The ink and handwriting are not the only fingerprints left by the past. Modern science has learned to read a far more intimate signature, the biological code embedded in the scrolls themselves. In recent years, researchers have turned to a revolutionary tool, ancient DNA analysis. Their target is not the ink, but the very parchment, the animal skins on which the words were written. By extracting minuscule, degraded genetic material from these 2,000-year-old fragments, scientists can now answer a seemingly simple question: what kind of animal gave its skin for this sacred text? The answers are rewriting the map of where these scrolls came from. In a landmark study, geneticists examined fragments from a selection of manuscripts. They discovered that the parchments were made from the skins of two different animals, sheep and cows. This in itself is not surprising, both were common sources. But the real revelation came from looking deeper at the sheep DNA. The genetic profiles showed that the sheep skins used for different scrolls came from distinctly different herds. Think of it like the wool in a sweater. You can sometimes trace it back to the specific flock of sheep it came from. Some scrolls shared a close genetic match, suggesting they were made from animals raised in the same region, possibly even the same farm. Others, however, were made from sheep that were genetically distinct, implying they were raised in separate locations, perhaps far apart. This single finding sends a tremor through all the established theories. If a single, isolated community at Qumran was producing all of its own scrolls, you would expect a certain consistency. They would be using the local herds, the sheep and goats that grazed near the Dead Sea. The parchment would show a relatively uniform genetic signature, but that is not what the DNA shows. Instead, it reveals a tapestry of sources. This diversity of animal origins points powerfully toward multiple production centers. It suggests that the scrolls were not all manufactured in one lonely desert scriptorium. Some of these texts were almost certainly written on parchment that was prepared elsewhere, in different workshops, possibly in Jerusalem or other towns, and then brought to the caves. This physical evidence from the skin itself lends startling support to the Jerusalem library theory. It paints a picture of a collection that was gathered from many places, a library assembled from the contributions of different communities or different scribble schools, rather than authored entirely in one closed enclave. The DNA does not tell us what the words say, but it whispers where the materials began their journey. It suggests that the caves near the Dead Sea were not a factory, but a vault, a final resting place for a library that was as geographically diverse as it was theologically profound. The very skin of the scrolls argues that their story is one of gathering, not just of creation. The DNA from the parchment tells one story, but the ink on its surface tells another. While genetics traced the origin of the animal skins, a separate team of scientists turned their attention to the very substance used to write the words, analyzing the chemical composition of the inks with a precision never before possible. They used a technique called X-ray fluorescence, which bombards a tiny sample with high energy beams, causing the atoms in the ink to emit a unique signature of light. Each element present, like iron, copper, or sulfur, glows with a specific color, allowing researchers to build an elemental fingerprint for the ancient scribes' recipe. What they found was both expected and extraordinary. Most of the inks were carbon-based, simple soot mixed with water and a gum binder, a common formula across the ancient world. But a significant number, particularly on some of the most important biblical scrolls, contained something unusual, a high concentration of bromine. This element is not a typical ingredient in ancient ink recipes. Its presence was a puzzle, a faint chemical clue waiting to be interpreted. Where did this bromine come from? The researchers' gaze turned to the landscape itself. The Dead Sea is unlike any other body of water on Earth, a hypersaline lake so dense with dissolved minerals that you float effortlessly on its surface. Its chemistry is dominated by salts like magnesium, calcium, and crucially, bromine. The waters of the Dead Sea have one of the highest natural concentrations of bromine on the planet. Could the scribes have used this local water to mix their ink? If the water used to prepare the ink came from the Dead Sea or from springs feeding into it, that unique bromine signature would have been transferred directly onto the parchment. This possibility is electrifying. It suggests a direct physical link between the act of writing and the specific geography of Qumran. Imagine a scribe in that plaster-lined room, grinding soot with a binder, then reaching for a jug of water drawn from a local well or catchment basin, water infused with the distinct minerals of the region. With every dip of his pen, he would be transferring not just words but a piece of the place itself onto the page. The bromine becomes a silent witness, a chemical tag that says, "This was written here." This forensic detail seems to powerfully support the idea of a local Qumran-based scriptorium, where scrolls were produced on site using the resources at hand. It anchors the creation of these texts to the stark shores of the Dead Sea. Yet, as with every clue in this mystery, the evidence is not so simple. Could bromine-rich water or salts have been a traded commodity? If the unique salts of the Dead Sea were harvested and sold across the region, perhaps as a preservative or for medicinal use, then an ink maker in Jerusalem could have purchased them and added them to his own recipe. The bromine fingerprint would then point to a material that was available, not a location that was exclusive. The chemical clue, so promising at first, becomes ambiguous upon closer inspection. It tells us what was in the ink, but not definitively where that ingredient was mixed into the formula. The ink analysis, combined with the DNA evidence, creates a fascinating and contradictory picture. The parchment suggests some scrolls came from elsewhere, while the ink on some of those same scrolls suggests they were written with local water. This could mean that blank parchment was imported to Qumran and then inscribed there. Or it could mean that finished scrolls from various places were brought to the site, and over centuries in the caves, the pervasive bromine-rich dust of the Dead Sea region settled onto them, contaminating the surface. Each scientific revelation adds a new layer of data, but also a new layer of complexity, proving that the story of the scrolls is written not in one hand, but in many across both space and time. Perhaps the search for a single author has been the problem all along. The stark choice between Essenes or Sadducees, between a desert sect or Jerusalem's priests, assumes that the 12 caves around Qumran tell one unified story. But what if they tell 12 different stories, a collection of deposits made by different hands for different reasons over hundreds of years? This is the modern, nuanced theory gaining traction, a synthesis that accepts the contradictions because it sees the caves not as a single library, but as a layered archaeological site. The evidence points not to a monolith, but to a mosaic. Consider the caves themselves. They are not identical. Cave 4 is the giant, a natural cavern just a stone's throw from the Qumran ruins. It was not a hiding place in the traditional sense, it was an archive. This single cave yielded fragments from over 500 different manuscripts, nearly half of the entire collection. The texts were not neatly stored in jars but piled in heaps, as if shelved for regular use. This looks like the working library of an active community, a central repository where scribes could consult biblical texts, sectarian rules, and interpretative commentaries. It feels like the heart of the operation. Now contrast that with Cave 7. It contained only Greek texts, fragments of the Septuagint, the Greek translation of the Hebrew Bible. This suggests a different audience, perhaps scholars or Hellenized Jews who valued these translations. Could this have been a personal cache, the scrolls of a single Greek-speaking member of the community, or even a separate deposit from a different group passing through? Then there is the concept of the Geniza. In Jewish tradition, a geniza is a storage room for worn-out sacred texts that contain the name of God. Because they cannot be simply thrown away, they are reverently stored until they can be properly buried. Several of the smaller, more inaccessible caves around Qumran, containing only small, damaged fragments of biblical texts, fit this description perfectly. They were not hiding places from Romans, but sacred trash heaps, a final resting place for scrolls that had reached the end of their usable life. This practice could have spanned generations, unrelated to any specific crisis. Finally, we must consider the emergency hide. The copper scroll in Cave 3, with its map to treasure, has no place in a geniza or a working library. It feels like a classified document buried in haste. Cave 1, where the first scrolls were found neatly sealed in jars, also has the feel of a deliberate, careful concealment of precious materials, perhaps when the community saw the Roman legions advancing in the year 68. This theory of multiple origins solves the riddle of the contradictory evidence. It allows for the Qumran settlement to have been home to a core community, likely Essene or Zadokite in character, which maintained the central library in Cave 4 and used the ritual baths and scriptorium. They would have been responsible for the bulk of the sectarian writings and many of the biblical copies, but over the centuries other people used the same remote landscape. Travelers, refugees, even bandits, knowing the area's reputation for secrecy, could have tucked their own precious texts into different caves. A priest fleeing Jerusalem might have hidden a satchel of temple hymns in one crevice. A family from a nearby village might have buried their small collection of scriptures for safekeeping during a local conflict. The desert cliffs became a natural safe deposit box system, used by a variety of clients across 4 turbulent centuries. This means the Dead Sea Scrolls are not the voice of one group, but a chorus of many. The search for the author does not end with a single name, but opens into a panorama of ancient Jewish life, preserved in fragments, scattered across the hills, waiting in the dark for a shepherd's errant stone. Deep within the sectarian scrolls, a shadowy figure commands the stage, a man known only as the teacher of righteousness. He is the magnetic, tragic hero of this desert story, the one who shepherded the community into the wilderness and founded their new covenant. The texts describe him with a mixture of reverence and anguish. He is the unique teacher, the one who possesses the final, authoritative interpretation of God's law and the prophets. He is also the persecuted one, hunted and condemned by a villain called the wicked priest. This priest, dripping with corruption from Jerusalem, even pursues the teacher to his place of exile to torment him on the Day of Atonement, the holiest day of the year. The conflict is intensely personal, a spiritual duel between purity and corruption that defines the community's entire reason for existing. But who was this teacher in the flesh? Was he a single, towering historical personality, or a symbol woven from scripture and hope? The answer reshapes our understanding of the scroll's origins. If he was a real man, then we can search history for his footprint. Some scholars, looking at the political turmoil of the 2nd and 1st centuries before the Common Era, have proposed candidates. Could he have been a deposed high priest, a rightful Zadokite ousted by a politically appointed rival? The scroll's deep priestly concerns and their fury at a corrupted temple make this a compelling fit. He would have been a man of immense religious authority, cast out, taking his loyal followers with him into the desert to preserve true worship. Others point to a later period, to the chaotic reign of the Hasmonean kings who combined the roles of king and high priest, a blasphemous act in the eyes of strict traditionalists. Perhaps the teacher was a devout priest who rebelled against this consolidation of power, becoming a martyr for his rigid principles. The emotional power of the texts, the raw sense of betrayal and vindication, feels like the legacy of a real, traumatic event led by a real leader. Yet there is another possibility, one that is more literary than literal. Could the teacher of righteousness be a composite figure, a prophetic archetype? In this reading, he is not one man but an ideal, a recurring character in the community's storytelling. He embodies the classic biblical pattern of the rejected prophet, like Jeremiah or the suffering servant described in the book of Isaiah. The community saw their own struggles reflected in these ancient templates, and so they crafted a founding myth that cast their movement as the latest and final chapter in God's long conflict with a disobedient world. Their teacher becomes an eternal figure, a role filled by successive leaders across generations, a perpetual voice of truth crying out in the wilderness. The evidence in the scrolls tantalizingly supports both views. Some passages speak of the teacher in the past tense as a foundational event. Others use language that suggests his guiding presence is ongoing, his interpretations continuing to unfold for the community. This ambiguity is the heart of the mystery. To see him as a historical founder gives the community a concrete birth date and a catalyst. To see him as an archetype makes the community itself the enduring teacher, a living institution that continually reveals God's will. His identity is the master key. If he was a specific ousted priest from Jerusalem, then the sect's origins are a direct schism from the temple's heart, a story of elite exile. If he is a symbol, then the community's roots may be more diffuse, emerging from a broader movement of disaffection and apocalyptic yearning. The search for the teacher, then, is not just about naming a man. It is about pinpointing the moment when a group of believers decided the world was too corrupt to save, and that their only hope was to retreat, to wait, and to write their truth onto leather, sealing it in jars for a future they would never see. The conflict over the calendar was a war fought with dates and numbers. For the community behind many of the scrolls, the correct schedule of holy days was not a matter of administrative preference. It was the very heartbeat of the covenant, the rhythm by which heaven and earth were meant to move in sync. They followed a strict 364-day solar calendar, a system they believed was ordained by God and revealed in the sacred texts. Meanwhile, the priests in charge of the Jerusalem temple operated on a lunar calendar, one based on the cycles of the moon, which required periodic adjustments and intercalary months to keep the seasons aligned. This created a profound and irreconcilable rift. Imagine your entire town celebrating the Day of Atonement, the most solemn fast of the year, while you and your community, just a few miles away, believe that sacred day actually occurred a week earlier. You are not just out of step, you are living in a different spiritual dimension. According to your beliefs, the temple priests are offering sacrifices on the wrong days. The festivals that connect Israel to its history and its God are being celebrated in what you see as a state of profound impurity and error. This was not a minor liturgical disagreement. It was an existential crisis. If the temple, the very center of the universe where God's presence dwelled, was operating on a faulty, human-devised calendar, then the entire mechanism of atonement and divine favor was broken. The nation's sins were not being forgiven. The agricultural blessings tied to the festivals were not being properly invoked. The cosmic clock was off, and the fault, they believed, lay with a corrupt and ignorant priesthood in Jerusalem. This calendar war explains the retreat to the desert with stunning clarity. When you believe the entire religious establishment has lost its connection to God's own timetable, you cannot simply reform it from within. You must separate completely. You must build a new community that operates in true sacred time, a community that follows the perfect, unchanging solar year they saw reflected in the order of creation. The scrolls are filled with texts detailing this solar calendar, often presented through elaborate astronomical observations and angelic revelations. For them, this was not an innovation, it was a restoration of a primordial truth that Jerusalem had forgotten or willfully abandoned. Their strict observance of this calendar in the isolation of Qumran was a continuous, silent protest against a world they saw as spiritually adrift. Every meal they ate, every prayer they recited on the day they deemed correct was an act of defiance and faithfulness. It was how they maintained their identity as the true Israel, the faithful remnant keeping the covenant pure while waiting for the day when God would reset the clock for everyone. The calendar they followed could not stop the march of Roman boots. Around the year 68, the brutal reality of history arrived at the lonely plateau. The archaeological record at Qumran tells a stark and sudden tale of destruction. In several rooms, excavators found a thick layer of ash and charred debris. The walls of the tower show signs of intense heat. Scattered among the ruins were iron arrowheads of a distinctive three-winged design, the exact type used by the Roman 10th Legion, the very unit tasked with crushing the Jewish revolt in Judea. The story written in the soil is one of violent conquest. Then there is the money. In one of the rooms, archaeologists discovered a small hoard of silver coins carefully placed together. The latest coin in this little treasure was minted in the year 67, just before the end. Someone, in a moment of panic or hope, tucked away their savings, perhaps intending to return. They never did. Piecing together the scene, we can reconstruct a desperate final chapter. The community, whether Essene, Zadokite, or something else, would have seen the smoke on the horizon from burning villages. They would have heard the terrifying news of the Roman advance. The 10th Legion was systematically clearing the countryside around Jerusalem, and the remote outpost at Qumran, despite its isolation, was directly in their path. The decision would have been agonizing but clear. Their greatest treasure was not silver but words. In a frantic, coordinated effort, they gathered the heart of their library, the biblical scrolls, the sectarian rules, the precious commentaries. They bundled them, carried them the short but difficult distance to the caves they knew so well, and sealed them in jars for protection. They chose not the easiest cave but the most hidden ones, some requiring ropes and climbing. This was not a casual storage, it was a sacred burial. They were entrusting their truth to the earth, hoping it would outlast the fire. Then they faced their fate. Some may have fled into the desert canyons. Others likely stood their ground in the fortified tower. A final, futile resistance met with a volley of Roman arrows and the torch. Qumran was overrun, its buildings burned, its inhabitants killed or scattered. The Romans moved on, leaving the ruins to the wind and the ashes to settle. They had no idea that the community's true legacy was not in the stones they shattered, but in the caves they never found. That single, desperate act of hiding the scrolls did more than save parchment. It created the very mystery we grapple with today. By sealing their library away, the people of Qumran vanished from history, but they left their voices behind, perfectly preserved in the dry, dark silence, waiting for a sound they could never have predicted, the crack of a shepherd's stone 2,000 years later. But the scrolls themselves were not the only thing kept hidden in the dark. For decades after their discovery, a new kind of mystery unfolded, one of academic gatekeeping and frustrating secrecy. While the world marveled at the ancient texts, a modern scandal was brewing around who got to read them. A small, exclusive international team of scholars, appointed early on, maintained a tight grip on the vast majority of the unpublished fragments. They worked in private, sharing little with the wider academic community. This bottleneck created a scholarly drought. Theories about the scrolls' origins and meaning were built on a tiny fraction of the evidence, while the rest remained locked away in museum drawers known only to a privileged few. The delay stretched from years into decades, fueling intense frustration and inevitably wild speculation. Conspiracy theories flourished. Were the scholars hiding something explosive, perhaps a text that could undermine major religious traditions? Was there a lost gospel of Jesus hidden among the Hebrew fragments? The secrecy itself became a story, casting a long shadow over the ancient discovery and creating a rift between the keepers of the scrolls and the global community desperate to understand them. The situation reached a breaking point in 1991. A quiet rebellion was underway. Using a newly completed concordance, a kind of index of all the scroll texts, researchers at Hebrew Union College in Cincinnati worked with the burgeoning technology of digital imaging. They managed to reconstruct the unpublished texts from the index data. More dramatically, the Huntington Library in California, which possessed a complete set of photographic negatives of the scrolls, decided to open its vaults. They announced that any qualified scholar could now access the images. This act of academic liberation was the final blow to the old regime. Almost immediately, an unauthorized 2-volume set of photographs of all the unpublished material was published. The dam had burst, the decades-long monopoly was over. Suddenly, the scrolls belonged to the world. This forced openness unleashed a tsunami of new research. Scholars from diverse fields, from linguistics to archaeology to religious studies, could finally examine the full evidence. Old theories were tested, new ones proposed, and the study of the Dead Sea Scrolls transformed from a private club into a vibrant global conversation. The modern scandal, a story of control and eventual liberation, proved that these ancient texts still held a powerful, disruptive energy, capable of challenging not just our understanding of the past, but the very way we choose to share knowledge. The ancient ink on those scrolls does more than record a forgotten sect, it rewrites history itself. This is why the question of authorship is not just an academic puzzle, it is a key that unlocks our understanding of a world at a crossroads. By identifying who wrote these texts, we gain a clearer picture of a transformative era, a time when the foundations of Western religious thought were being laid, stone by stone, in the midst of political chaos and fervent hope. The scrolls force us to abandon any simple story of a single, monolithic Judaism before the fall of the temple. Instead, they reveal a vibrant, noisy marketplace of ideas. Here were Pharisees debating law, Sadducees upholding priestly tradition, apocalyptic prophets preaching in the wilderness, and the community at Qumran, whoever they were, crafting their own rigorous path. This incredible diversity, preserved in the desert, shows that the Judaism of 2,000 years ago was a tapestry of many threads, not a single strand. The scrolls are the most important archaeological evidence we have for this complex, real world, a world where debate was the lifeblood of faith. For scholars of the Hebrew Bible, the impact is even more direct. Before the Dead Sea Scrolls, the oldest complete Hebrew manuscripts of the Bible were from the Middle Ages, copied over 1,000 years after the events they describe. The scrolls catapulted us back to the source. Suddenly, we could see the book of Isaiah, the Psalms, and Deuteronomy in a form that was ancient even in the time of Jesus. This allowed for breathtaking comparisons. In most cases, the texts proved remarkably stable, a testament to the care of generations of scribes. But in other places, there were fascinating variations, different wordings, additional lines, or alternate arrangements. These differences are not mistakes, they are snapshots of the Bible as a living, breathing document, still being shaped and discussed in the centuries before its final form was settled. The scrolls show us the Bible in motion, capturing the moment before the ink fully dried on the canon. This directly shapes our understanding of both Rabbinic Judaism and Christianity. Rabbinic Judaism, which rose from the ashes of the temple's destruction, was not created in a vacuum. The debates, the legal interpretations, the very language of the rabbis find echoes in the scrolls. The Qumran community's obsession with law, purity, and scripture interpretation shows they were part of a broader intellectual conversation that would eventually flow into the Talmud. They represent one powerful voice in that conversation, a voice that chose separation, while the Pharisees, another voice, chose engagement with the wider world. Christianity, too, emerges in sharper focus. The scrolls do not contain Christian texts, but they illuminate the Jewish soil from which Christianity grew. Concepts like a Messiah, a new covenant, baptismal washing, and sacred communal meals were not Christian inventions. They were Jewish ideas circulating widely. When John the Baptist preached in the wilderness near the Dead Sea, or when Jesus spoke of the kingdom of God, they were speaking a language their Jewish audience would have recognized, even if they radically reinterpreted its meaning. The scrolls help strip away centuries of later theological separation, showing us that the earliest followers of Jesus were participating in Jewish debates, offering a new answer to a very old question: how do we live in covenant with God? So, solving the authorship enigma is not about pinning a name to a ghost. It is about context. If the authors were Essenes, we see a radical withdrawal that still influenced the wider culture. If they were Zadokite priests, we witness a conservative rebellion from within the religious elite. If the caves held a library from Jerusalem, we grasp the breathtaking intellectual wealth that was nearly lost forever. Each possibility colors our view of that pivotal century differently. Ultimately, the scrolls matter because they give voice to the silenced, to the losers of history. The Romans crushed the revolt, the temple was destroyed, and the Qumran community vanished. Their particular vision of Judaism did not survive. Yet, because they hid their words in jars, their voice now speaks louder than ever, reminding us that history is written by the survivors, but sometimes truth is preserved by those who disappeared. The truth is, we have not solved this mystery, not yet. The debate over the scrolls has not ended. It has simply entered a new, more sophisticated phase. Today, the search for the authors is no longer just about translating words. It is about deploying the tools of the 21st century to interrogate the physical objects themselves. The frontier has moved from the library to the laboratory. Scientists are now applying next-generation DNA sequencing to the parchment, hoping to build a genetic map so precise it can pinpoint not just the species, but the very regional herds the animals came from. This could definitively show which scrolls were made from local sheep and which were imports, tracing invisible trade routes across ancient Judea. At the same time, artificial intelligence is being trained to analyze scribble hands with superhuman precision. An algorithm can compare thousands of letter forms in seconds, detecting subtle patterns and connections no human eye could ever see, potentially identifying individual scribes across different scrolls and revealing the hidden network of writers behind the library. Meanwhile, boots are still on the ground. Archaeologists continue to survey every inch of the Judean Desert, using drones and ground-penetrating radar to scan for caves that might have been missed, any crevice that could hold one more jar, one more fragment that changes the story. And in museum basements and research institutes, the painstaking work of reconstruction continues. Tens of thousands of tiny, fingernail-sized fragments remain unplaced, a colossal jigsaw puzzle waiting for its key piece. Scholars hover over light tables, using digital overlays and spectral imaging to try and match a scrap of psalm to a known manuscript, or to find the edge of a rule that tells us something new about daily life. The next chapter of this story is being written right now, in labs, in code, and in the silent patience of researchers. The most important discovery about the Dead Sea Scrolls may still be sitting in a drawer or lying undiscovered in a shadowy cave, just one excavation season away from rewriting everything we think we know. The scrolls refuse to give up a single, simple truth. We have walked through the stark desert of the Essene hypothesis, climbed the fortified towers of the Jerusalem library theory, and navigated the priestly purity laws of the Zadokite retreat. Each explanation shines a compelling light on the evidence, yet each also casts long, contradictory shadows. Perhaps that is the most profound lesson of all. These ancient texts, in their stubborn silence, have outlasted the Roman Empire that scattered their keepers, the kingdoms that rose and fell above their caves, and even the modern scholars who fought to claim their meaning. The authors defined themselves through cryptic clues and fierce convictions, yet they remain just beyond our grasp, known only by the words they left behind and the jars they so carefully sealed. This is not a failure of history, but a testament to it. The very fact that we can debate their identity so passionately 2,000 years later means their mission succeeded beyond their wildest dreams. They preserved a voice for the future, so now we pass the question to you. After this journey through the desert and the decades of debate, which theory resonates most with you? Do you hear the disciplined chant of Essene monks in the dry air, the hurried whispers of Jerusalem priests saving their nation's soul, or the layered echoes of many communities using the cliffs as a sacred vault? Share your verdict in the comments below, and if you are drawn to mysteries where the past guards its secrets closely, subscribe and join us as we continue to explore history's greatest enigmas, one uncovered clue at a time.